a better makeup of pollen that those native pollinators need. So the other thing is we have a lot of nativars, which are cultivars of native plants. So like Blonde Ambition, for example, that's a blue grama grass that's really popular. It's really beautiful. But it's different than the straight species. It's much bigger, it's much showier. So that is a cultivar of a native plant, or some people call them nativars. Where that becomes a little tricky, and I'm going to talk about this later on too, but where that becomes a little tricky is, for instance, there are certain caterpillars, butterfly larvae, that whose host plant are native grasses. And some of our native grasses have cultivars where the leaf color is different, and that's going to mix up those native pollinators, and they're not going to be able to use that. So we might think, oh, well, it's a switchgrass, this caterpillar needs switchgrass, but if the plant, like if the leaf is really red instead of green, it's not going to be able to use that. So there are these nuances there. It's also important to kind of define what a native plant is. Again, hotly contested, but we do have some definitions that we can point to and are generally accepted. So the Colorado Native Plant Society and the Federal Native Plant Conservation Committee use this one. A native plant is a species that occur naturally in a particular region, state, ecosystem, and habitat without direct or indirect human actions. And then we have species that have been in place since the advent of European colonists in North America. So you can see with both of those, it's about human interaction or human intervention there. We know that Native Americans moved plants around, but they didn't bring plants from other continents. So you know, when we talk about native plants, we have our political borders. Colorado is a square, right? But we certainly have regions that are very similar that go up into Wyoming and over into the, you know, Kansas, Nebraska, southwest. And that's because we have something called ecoregions. So these two maps are ecoregions. So landscapes are part of a larger ecoregion. You can see in the map on the left there, that's a little bit further, sort of a higher viewpoint. So I don't know if you can read the tiny print there, but sort of the bright green in the bottom right is the southwestern tablelands. Then you have the High Plains, the Wyoming Basin, Colorado Plateau. So all of these are named. And ecoregions denote areas that have general ecosystem similarities. So the type, the quality, and the quantity of environmental resources are going to be similar. So soils are going to be similar, precipitation is going to be similar, and then vegetation is going to be similar. Now, if we look at the map on the right, that is a little more fine grain. We're looking a little more closely. You can see there are lots and lots and lots. On the left, we have what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the right, we have, you know, over 20 different ecoregions at a more fine scale. So where in there do we consider something to be native? And that is, again, it's a bit up for debate. Some people say if it grows in Colorado, it's a Colorado native, but there might be something that grows really well and is strongly native in the southwest part of Colorado, and you're never going to find it in the Northeast. Does that mean that you can still plant it in the Northeast and say, well, it's a Colorado native? That's for you to decide. But this is kind of what we mean. We're looking at these ecoregions. And again, we recognize that these ecoregions are going to move into other states, and they're not going to just follow our political borders. Now, if we talk about Front Range and foothills, and I recognize that some of you are probably watching from elsewhere, but Resource Central is based here on the Front Range. That is a very well-defined area. So it's east of the Continental Divide and west of the prairies, right? West of the prairie and plains. Looking north to south, we're generally talking about the Wyoming border to about Colorado Springs. But within that area, we've got all these different habitat types: forests and rocky hillsides, wetlands, shortgrass prairie, like going out into Pawnee Buttes a little bit. And so you have several vegetative communities that are possible. Our mountain species are not going to do so well down in the lowlands and vice versa. Now, being a plant in Colorado is really hard. We have hard climate, we have really tricky soils. So, when we go to a garden center and pick a plant just because, we're like, oh, that's really beautiful, I want that in my yard, it can potentially take a lot of resources to kind of baby it and keep it alive. And this is because, again, it's a hard place to be a plant. So the reason the Front Range and foothills is so tricky is because of our proximity to the Rocky Mountains. It creates a really complex climate. So we can have extremely high winds, very drying winds. We can have super heavy rainstorms. We can have tons of snow, or we can have no snow. Where I live, we've had hardly any snow so far. We're sort of getting into March is usually the snowier time, and they're saying that we're going to get like 10 to 12 inches tomorrow. We'll see if that happens. And then we can have extreme temperature fluctuations and polar vortexes. We've had several of those over the last 10 years or so, where we're in the 60s, 70s during the day, and then it just plummets and we're below zero. Think about being a plant. If it's during the growing season still, that does a lot of damage. And then our soils go from well drained and rocky to really sticky clay. So again, it's hard to be a plant here. If we can use native plants or adapted plants that do better here, then we're going to have more success. So how do we use native plants? They can absolutely be incorporated into an existing landscape. It's not all or nothing. We don't have to only have natives. Phoebe and I were talking earlier before the webinar started, and the Garden in a Box program is starting to incorporate more natives. And that's due in large part because of customer demand. People are just getting more curious about it. They want to see more of these. And Garden in a Box is such a cool program because it really makes it easy. It gives you the design, you pick up the plants, pop them in the ground, and hopefully they do really well. So if you can get native plants that way, that's a bonus. But I do think it's important to know that it's not all or nothing. That garden right there is Centennial Gardens in Denver. It's near Elitch's. And this was all going back a ways, but when Wellington Webb was the mayor of Denver, he and his wife took a trip to France or something, and they came back, and his wife said, you know what, I want to have formal fancy gardens like what we saw in France, but I want to celebrate the Centennial State, Colorado, so let's use Colorado native plants. And so that's what they've done. Not all natives there, but a majority natives. And so again, that brings us back to how do we use native plants? So when we're gardening, we're always creating this abstraction of nature. It's not exactly like what you would see out on a hike or in a forest, but it's some sort of abstraction of that. It can be very naturalistic, like the picture in the upper left. That is kind of a habitat garden, like the stone walkway. You've got ground covers, trees, shrubs, grasses. The one on the upper right is a little more, these are demonstration gardens, but they're meant to, the one on the upper right is meant to be sort of like typical suburban home. You've got your patch of grass, and then you've got your shrub border around that, and then some trees. But you can also do formal gardens. It's just all in how you design the garden. So the picture on the lower left has the strong geometry, lots of symmetry. So that's going to give a more formal feel. So they can be kind of messy and unkempt, or they can be more well-defined. There's a lot of talk about lawn alternatives right now. There's turf buyback programs, cash for grass, all kinds of things. And people are definitely looking at shrinking their turf footprint. You can also, so you can convert your lawn, you can to something totally different, like shrubs, perennials, that sort of thing. You can convert to a native grass lawn, something like a blue grama buffalo grass mix. It's not going to ever handle as much foot traffic as what like a traditional fescue or Kentucky bluegrass lawn can handle. But again, it's up to your, design aesthetic and how you're going to be using this space. And it's a good idea to start small. Of course, you can totally remove all of your yarn, just rip it out, but you always want to have a plan. You want to make sure that you know what you're going to put in there rather than ripping it out because you don't want to put water on it and then just having this open bed of soil where weed seeds can move in. It can become a muddy mess. So you always want to make a plan. Um, but like with the garden in a box, or I mean with Resource Central's turf removal program, they'll come in and they'll help you remove some of that turf, and then putting in a garden in a box is a great idea, or at least having some sort of idea. You can always lay flagstone patios, if you don't need that turf area. And we have native plants that work well for ground covers. A lot of times people will plant something like thyme, creeping thyme between flagstone pavers. Not a native, but this one right here is called Antonaria parvifolia, or pussy toes. It's just sort of a matte gray ground cover that'll fill in, and it gets cute little flowers during part of the growing season. This cartoon I just think is great. You can see the dad there just kind of doing his lawnmower thing, and the kiddo there saying, "Dad, I think we have to have a talk about the bees and the flowers." So definitely wanting to move more toward that kind of natural ecosystem within our landscaped space. It can do so much. It can be so beneficial. We can increase biodiversity, support wildlife, create habitat. And to me, again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's more interesting and it's prettier if there's more going on and we've got lots of things blooming. So, okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and move into, excuse me, different, I'm just going to start running through plant options. So we're going to talk about trees, shrubs, perennials, and grasses. But quickly before I do that, I see a couple of questions I want to answer. So one is, if we were to get a heavily wet summer, you're not necessarily dreaming, it could happen. Would it cause any harm to native plants that are not requiring much water? That's a great question. So one thing about native plants is that they can handle extreme periods of drought, and then hopefully they can also handle when we sort of get the deluge. Usually what happens with a native plant, if it gets too much water, is it gets leggy, it grows big, and it might flop over. And then on the other side, if we just have, once it's established, if we have a really droughty period and you're not giving it a ton of supplemental water, it's just going to be kind of puny and not as robust, but it's going to still survive. So you're not going to have to baby it as much. Of course, you can certainly kill native plants with too much water, but hopefully if it's a natural precipitation cycle, they're going to be able to handle it. And then I saw this one that was interesting to me. Given the effects of climate change on regional native zones, wouldn't it be a good idea to plant things that are on the edge of our native zone? Yeah, so that is a very interesting way to look at it. And so they say that I can't remember how many years, but what we're looking at is sort of like the panhandle of Texas, is what they're saying our climate is going to be in the future. Which is quite similar to what we have now, but it is drier. But sort of the south is moving up a bit. So yes, particularly with trees, people are starting to look at, what trees should we be planting given climate change, because they're in the ground for 20, 30, 40, 60, 70 years, right? So if we're planting perennials and ornamental grasses, they're going to be around for 5, 10, maybe 15 years. So I think that while it's a good thing to consider, it's, not such a big deal in the immediate, but certainly when you're looking at tree species, I think it's a great idea to be looking at that. Okay, I'm gonna carry on. And again, I'll stop for more questions later. So first, we are going to look at trees. So we don't have a lot of native trees here in Colorado. I'm sorry, not in Colorado, but along the Front Range, or even really in Colorado. We don't have tons and tons of tree species. We have our evergreens that are wonderful. And we have some trees that are typically found along riparian areas, but most of the trees in the urban canopy that we have in our urban areas are non-native because it's just not it's just not the ecosystem in which this area developed. But as humans, we like to have some shady areas, and so we plant trees. So the way this talk works is I'm going to do sort of a like, instead of using this really common thing, here's an alternative. It's never going to be an exact one for one, but we're trying to go after some similar traits in how they look and, excuse me, the kind of conditions that they need. But so instead of calorie pear, which hopefully nobody is planting anymore, they smell awful, they don't support any invertebrates really or wildlife. But you could look at serviceberry, Amelanchier alnifolia. So this is really more of a large shrub or a multi-stemmed tree, but gets really beautiful white spring blooms, really delicate and lovely. It has a nice smooth dark bark, and it has an edible fruit that is quite tasty. Instead of paper birch, Betula peperifera, we don't see a ton of this planted, but people do like how it looks. But we've got our native aspen, which does obviously really well here. There can be some issues with aspens down at lower elevation, though I have seen some aspen trees down here that are absolutely gigantic. They're planted in like around condo developments, and they've been in the ground for like 30 years and they're beautiful. So it's a little hit or miss. It can be tricky to have aspen in cultivation because of how they send up new trees. But again, if you're planning for that and you know you're going to have that, then you can make it work for your space. Similar white bark. Again, native to higher elevation, and there are some pest problems. But again, if you're going for that look, then aspen's going to be better than a paper birch. Here's another one instead of Russian olive. Hopefully nobody is ever planting Russian olive, but we do have a lot of Russian olives that people still kind of have in their yards. Silver buffalo berry is a great alternative. Has that silvery green foliage, gets really nice red berries, great for wildlife. It does have some thorns. So it's not something that you want to be, if you use this, you don't want to be, have it in an area that you need to like be in and working around a lot. But it has a really pretty texture and nice silvery gray color. Instead of silver maple, we have lots of silver maples around here. We have a great native maple. This is big tooth maple. Has that same lovely maple leaf shape. Chlorosis is not going to be an issue. People love to plant maples because they get the great fall color, and rightly so. I understand that, but maples almost always have issues with chlorosis. If you don't know what that is, it's where the leaves turn yellow and just start to look kind of sickly. And it's because there's not enough, they can't access the iron in the soil. It's an iron deficiency. So interestingly, our soils actually have a lot of iron in them, but because we have very alkaline soil, the iron is really bound up and it's not available to the plants. So people that have different kinds of non-native maples, often treat and add iron. And it's like, yes, that's something you can do, but you're going to have to always do that. So with the big tooth maple, you can get that pretty fall color and not have those issues. It also has a really nice, lovely branching pattern. Instead of cockspur hawthorn, which is a small tree, we have common hop tree. Don't see this used a ton, but it's a really lovely tree. It's very aromatic. The leaves smell kind of citrusy when they're crushed, has kind of a glossy leaf. You can see there. Pretty little clusters of white flowers, not super showy, but attractive. And then it has this wafer-like samara or fruit. So hop trees, I really like hop trees a lot. Small, it's a small tree. Instead of cranberry bush viburnum, I feel like these are used a ton and they almost always have issues. They get area mites, they start to look kind of scraggly and funky, they die out in the middle. So potentially instead of that, we could do chokecherry. Has a nice white spring bloom, has a persistent fruit, and this one will tolerate shade like cranberry bush viburnum will. Chokecherry, of course, they can get kind of tall and they form a thicket. So again, you want to plan for that and know that it's going to take up some space. But this is a great one for pollinators and wildlife too. Instead of smoke bush. Now, here's one. Smoke bush is very cool looking. You know, it gets the pink poof things that people plant it for. And you know, they don't really take a ton of water, but we needed to find an alternative for it. And so we're going with Gamble oak. So this is our native oak tree. It's a small oak tree. You can see the acorns there. Gets kind of a rusty fall color, tolerates some shade. If you see it out in the wild, it's going to be an understory tree. So again, it can handle some of that shade. It can be multi or single stem tree, doesn't get too tall. And if you're a bird person, it's an absolute must. They love the acorns. They love to take shelter in there. Excellent, excellent tree for birders. Okay, that concludes our tree section. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to get through shrubs, and then I think we'll stop for questions there. I have a lot to cover, and I don't want to run out of time. So, okay, instead of Russian sage, I really dislike Russian sage. It's beautiful. I mean, you see that picture, look at that kind of airy, nice, kind of lavendery color. But for one thing, I think it smells horrible. If you've ever had to work in or in around it, I really don't like how it smells. But it is so aggressive. It's really, really hard to manage. It will get covered with bees, mostly honeybees, which are not native bees. So it's not going to really support a ton of our native pollinators, but it is so darn aggressive. It will grow into your turf grass. It will grow over pavers and under edging. So once you have Russian sage, it's super duper hard to get rid of. So I highly recommend that you don't plant Russian sage. But an alternative there is lead plant, Amorpha canescens. So it gets these blue, purple blooms in summer. And then you can see it has bright orange pollen. So it blooms up on these spikes and it gets bright orange pollen, which is just really pretty. The yellow, I mean, the orange and the purple together. It has a nice upright habit and it's a legume. So it fixes nitrogen. It's doing good stuff down in the soil and bees absolutely love it. Honeybees, but also our native bees really love it. There are this is a shrub that'll get, I don't know, it might get about 5 feet tall and wide, but we also have some dwarf varieties. So it still has the nice foliage, it gets the nice similar flowers, but it's going to be a little more compact and small. Okay, instead of lilac, now here again, I'm a plant person. I love plants. I do love native plants, but I feel like on a lot of these I'm saying, you know, I love lilacs, but here's the alternative. So lilacs are beautiful. I grew up in Fort Collins and, you know, I associate spring with lilacs because there were so many there, but not native. They have issues. They get powdery mildew a lot. So unless you really, really love lilac and need to have a lilac, if you're just attracted to the look, a really great alternative is rock spirea. This is a native shrub. Gets that same white panicle bloom. They have really interesting seed heads. So you're getting multi-season interest, not just the flowers. They can handle some shade, which is nice. It's hard to find plants that bloom and can handle some shade. And they're very xeric, so really don't need a lot of water at all. Instead of winter creeper, now this is not one that I'm going to say, oh, I really kind of like this. Winter creeper, it's planted a lot. It's a kind of a low-growing shrub. You see it in commercial plantings a lot, but a lot of homes have it too. Developers tend to like them. And I feel like they're always kind of sun-scalded and burned, and they get pruned funny. It's so rare that you ever see a winter creeper that looks nice. They tend to be more of a shady plant, but we have a lovely shade-tolerant, small, short shrub, and that is grape holly, Mahonia repens. Has evergreen foliage, same as winter creeper. It does have more of a creeping growth habit, and it gets a really pretty bright yellow flowers that you see in the picture that have a sweet smell, and then it also gets a fruit that is edible, and wildlife are really going to love that. There are other species of Mahonia that are more upright. They're not native, but those are also a good alternative to the winter creeper if you want something a little taller. Instead of barberry, we've got three-leaf sumac, Rus trilobata. So these have low, dense growth. They have nice leaf arrangement, kind of pretty inconspicuous flowers. That sort of lime green color on the right is the flower cluster. But they also have an ornamental fruit. So you can see on the left is the barberry fruit, and on the right is the sumac berry. I'm not suggesting that anyone go out and eat this, but it is also called lemonade bush because some people who do eat them think that it tastes like lemonade. You should always check several references to make sure before you eat anything in the wild to make sure that you have the right plant and that it's safe to eat. But I have been known to nibble these berries a little bit. Not the tastiest thing in the world, but maybe in a pinch. Instead of Bumald spirea, we've got a patchy plume. So this is an interesting shrub. They get covered in these kind of poofy, floofy seed heads, all growing season long. You can see the genus and species there. That's Felugia paradoxa. And the paradoxa, when you're looking at Latin names, there's usually a reason. The species is going to mean something. Like a lot of times things that bloom white are genus alba, alba being white. But this one, paradoxa, and the paradox is that it has a very long bloom time, and on the same plant, you'll have lots of flowers and lots of seed heads. So if you think of most plants, you're going to have bloom, they're going to, do their blooming time, and then those are all going to turn into seeds or fruit and then be done. But you get both with a patchy plume. Some people think they look kind of messy, and their branching structure is pretty wild. They're kind of like going in all different directions. It's not something that you can really prune and have be really architectural. But I think they're really pretty and really xeric, and you're getting these really pretty flowers and the pretty seed heads. And then they do have this contrasting foliage color, sort of a limey green with the pinky and white seed heads and flowers. Instead of forsythia, forsythia is certainly kind of a harbinger of spring. You get those nice golden yellow flowers. But again, if you're looking for natives, golden currant blooms at the same time. Bright yellow flowers bloom quite early, have a really pretty kind of clove scent. It's quite an upright shrub. They're going to grow fairly large, 4 to 5 feet. And then they get covered in currants, in fruit. So again, that can be for you, that can be for songbirds and wildlife. But this is a really pretty one that is a great addition, excellent for wildlife, and a really nice kind of anchor plant in any yard. Instead of butterfly bush, this is one that when I do these talks in person and I say instead of butterfly bush, and I sort of get gasps from the crowd because people love butterfly bush. But again, if you're really trying to push towards native, increasing biodiversity and supporting more wildlife, fern bush is an excellent one. So again, similar flower shape, It blooms all summer long, and this one will be absolutely covered in pollinators. Pollinators love this one too. Very drought tolerant. I feel like this one could be used a lot more. Instead of boxwood, we've got Smith's buckthorn, Rhamnus smithii. So this has glossy excuse me, semi-evergreen foliage, similar to boxwood. It's great for wildlife. It provides excellent cover. And this one we're starting to see it more and more in the trade. You know, in the horticulture world, plants are kind of trialed out to see how they do in pots and containers and see if they're going to be appropriate for sale through nurseries. And we are starting to see this one more. It's a really attractive plant. And I will say on some of these shrubs, when I say good for wildlife, if you're interested and into wildlife gardening, like supporting songbirds, you know, whatever it might be, and pollinators, we talk a lot about something called vertical structure in a landscape. And that's, you know, so that means you're going to have things from ground covers to perennials to grasses to shrubs to trees, and kind of you have everything all in between. So like you're not just having ground cover and trees. Vertical structure is super, super important when you're trying to provide habitat. So as you're thinking through plants and thinking through designing your garden, that's just something to keep in mind if you're interested in wildlife and pollinator gardening. Instead of a shrub rose, we've got Stansberry's cliff rose. This is a really interesting plant. They get absolutely covered in flowers. You can see it's a similar look. Not exactly the same, but it's got that nice open flower. Gets really pretty, kind of feathery seed heads, has this lobed foliage. You can see in the picture kind of a tight, compact foliage, likes full sun. And again, it'll just be covered in these flowers. So it's a lot of bang for your buck. Also, instead of shrub rose, and if you have a shady area, you can try Boulder raspberry. Also has these nice white blooms. You can see very similar. It likes part shade, like I said. So if you're looking for something to kind of tuck into a shady area, this is a great one. They are thornless. They have kind of reddish stems, so you get a nice contrast there. And they do produce a fruit that is raspberry-ish. It does not taste lovely like a raspberry. So you're really not planting this for the food, but rather for the nice habit and the pretty white flowers. Okay, instead of Bloomis spirea, again, these can be absolutely covered in pollinators, which is fantastic, but not native. Desert 4 o'clock is a good alternative. So if I go back, you can see it has kind of a similar habit and shape. It's not so shrubby, but they have a deep taproot, and then they kind of grow out from that, and they will be just covered with these kind of petunia-shaped bell flowers all summer long, just absolutely covered. And then they've got that silvery kind of mounding foliage. Instead of burning bush, which I feel like sometimes you'll see a burning bush and it's just as absolutely gorgeous, but more often than not, they're pruned incorrectly, they're just not maintained well, and they just don't look that good. So an alternative there is red osier dogwood. They get brilliant red stems in the winter, really, really pretty. And then they have these white flowers and they get some fruit. So these are used a lot. You see them a lot. Landscapers love to use them. They're used in commercial settings a ton. Some people might say that they're overused, but you know, they have those really pretty red stems, which adds a lot, particularly a lot of winter interest. And it's kind of a solid shrub. They do well here. They're attractive, nice big leaves, nice flower clusters. Those white flowers, fruit. Okay, instead of columnar buckthorn, we've got Rocky Mountain maple. So we have another maple tree. So they have red buds and stems. You can see that pretty red color with the bright green leaves. They have ornamental fruit, so they get those samaras like the helicopters, like other maples do. And they like some shade, so they're kind of an understory tree, and they're a small. I have it in the shrub section. It's kind of a medium-sized shrub, small tree, but really excellent plant. Okay, we're gonna stop for questions for a minute. And I'm going to try to give me just a second while I kind of look through. Yeah, and Phoebe, if you have any that you want me to point to, let me know. Let's see. Okay,
All
I've
right.
got one about aspen real quick. I'm gonna do. Is it okay to plant an aspen in neighborhoods? They don't follow property lines. That is absolutely true. So with anything like aspen or choke cherry that's going to sort of form that thicket, you do want to be a responsible neighbor and plant owner and recognize that they're potentially going to spread. So you need to take that into consideration. And every site is different. And so it's going to really be up to you to kind of make that call. I don't really recommend aspens being planted down like, Longmont, Erie, Lafayette, like anywhere for, further east than that. People do it all the time because they're so pretty. But if you have a little more space, that's going to be a better thing. What tree was recommended instead of silver maple? That was big-tooth maple. That's our native maple tree. Choke cherry trees produce annoying suckers. Right, yes, they do. And that's, so you just have to plan for that. So some people are going to have a perfect spot for a choke cherry, and some people are not. If you have a very small yard, choke cherry is probably not the best. But if you have a little more space, and you're really, you might want to screen something, you might be really into wildlife and pollinator gardening, then it might be just the right plant. So again, with all of these recommendations, I'm just throwing all these different plants at you. It doesn't mean every single one of these plants is perfect for you. You still have to do the research. You still need to check out the mature size. Do you have the right light requirements, all that stuff. But hopefully this kind of gives you a starting point. Let's see. Somebody says, I don't think I cover this, so I'm just gonna, oh, maybe I do. Anyway, but somebody's asking about weed barrier. I'm just gonna answer that really quickly. So we do not recommend weed barrier. Landscape companies still install it. People still think it's gonna help, but sort of common and best practices now says that you should not install weed barrier. There are all kinds of issues with it. So first of all, in the long term, it doesn't really work. It's not going to keep weeds at bay that well. It might for the first few seasons, but as dirt and dust and things blow in, weeds are going to blow. Weeds can grow on top. If you have really tough weeds, they can actually grow up through. I have heard people say, well, but it's so, those weeds that do grow on top, it's so easy to pull them up because they're not really anchoring their roots in the soil. That might be true, but there are other issues with it too. It's constantly pulling up at the edges and you have to keep tucking it in. It can become hydrophobic where it's not letting water infiltrate into the soil and get to the plants that you do want to have water. It's not particularly made out of great material. So definitely lots of issues, and a good solid layer of mulch is going to provide great benefit to your landscape. It's going to help suppress weeds. It's going to help build the soil. It's going to protect the soil better than weed barrier. So no to weed barrier. If you have weed barrier, doesn't mean you have to go pull it up right away. But if you're redoing areas, you can kind of pull it up a section at a time kind of thing. I've done plenty of classes where I say all that I just did about weed barrier, and I see these people's face drop and they say, we just installed our whole landscape. The landscape company talked us into putting weed barrier everywhere. What do we do? If that's your situation, don't worry about it. But if you have the opportunity to make the choice to not do it, then we recommend not doing weed barrier. Is the grape holly invasive? I've got some kind of holly that is popping up everywhere. So a native plant is never going to be considered invasive. Invasive means it has been introduced, it has come in from elsewhere, it has no natural pests to sort of keep it in check. So the grape holly, the Mahonia, is not invasive. Think native plants can be aggressive, and you can usually find that out and again sort of plant for that. I'm trying to think what you might have that is sort of taking over, and I don't know. Mahonia isn't even particularly aggressive, so I'm not sure what that might be, but somebody else says, I'm looking for a native low height bird friendly plant to grow under a spruce tree. Will the Mahonia work for that? So this is a great question. Potentially, yes. So Mahonia, again, this is a plant that you might see out on a hike in the foothills, and it's going to be in that sort of evergreen forest, it's like ponderosa, that kind of forest as a understory tree. So it is native, it is low height, and it is bird friendly, and it can handle being under a tree. Now, the question about it being under a spruce tree, typically nothing grows under a spruce tree. And the reason is because if you picture spruces, if you can't differentiate between a ponderosa and a spruce, you can just Google it. Spruce trees are very conical and their branches go all the way to the ground naturally. A ponderosa, on the other hand, they shed their branches and they have them less frequently. And you'll have a ponderosa, a mature ponderosa might the lowest branch might be 8 feet in the up high. So you never want to limb up a spruce tree because they are designed, everything about them is designed to have branches that go all the way to the ground. Sometimes people limb them up because maybe they want to be able to see better or they like how it looks more. If you've done that, that's okay. You can deal with it. But if you have a spruce tree, if you encounter a spruce tree and think, oh, I don't like how this looks, or I want to, have more clearance, highly recommend that you do not limb it up because there are a couple things that can happen. It can stress the spruce out, but also spruce trees have really dense branches. And I've seen this more than once. We get a big, strong windstorm, and the branches act like a sail. Wind can actually go up and under and lift the tree out of the ground. It sounds crazy. I have pictures of it. Lift the tree out of the ground and flop it over. And again, that's because the spruce branches are really stiff and dense. They're not meant to have wind go through there. So that was a really long-winded way to say, yes, you can plant Mahonia under a spruce tree, but if your spruce branches go all the way to the ground, just leave it be. Don't grow anything under it. But if your spruce is already limbed up, then Mahonia could potentially be a good option. Another thing to note, when people want to plant under trees, particularly evergreens, you got to be really careful. Usually those trees don't have a lot growing under them because there are so many roots. So you can try to plant some things, but you have to be so careful that you don't disrupt the roots too much. And so just a nice thick layer of mulch might be a better option. And then kind of a little further out, plant some of those other shrubs and whatever other plants. So I thought buckthorn was non-native invasive. There are non-native invasive buckthorns, but the Smith's, oh, now that it's not in front of me, I can't remember, Smithsonii is native. So there are lots and lots of plants in the same genus. So buckthorn has the same genus, but the species is different. So the one that I shared is a native species. Is the cliff rose bothered by Japanese beetle? That's a good question. I'm not sure. Japanese beetle, the worst. I don't know. Can you prune and shape Smith buckthorn like you can a boxwood? Not quite as much. I mean, boxwood can really take that really intense pruning. You can do that to some extent. I don't know that you would ever get like a full topiary from that, but you can do some of that. All right, I see two more that I am going to answer, and then we'll move on, and I'll still try to make it to all these. How invasive can three-leaf sumac be? Will it naturalize? Um, so three-leaf sumac is native, so it's not going to be invasive, and it doesn't need to naturalize. Naturalize means something that is non-native but not invasive, and it grows and it kind of fills in its little niche, and it becomes naturalized as if it were always there. So that's more of an adapted plant, but three-leaf sumac is native. Wish you'd give the approximate heights of the shrub. Sorry, I thought I was giving approximate heights. Maybe I didn't for all of them. I apologize. But again, Phoebe or somebody from Resource Central is going to send out a list of all of these. I have instead of this, plant this, and all the information on, you'll need to do more research on all the plants, and you can find all that out online. And then I saw another one. Oh, is mock orange on the native list too? So it is not, because it's not actually a native, but I love mock orange. There are some great mock oranges that do really well here, but not native. Okay, I'm going to carry on. How are we doing on time? Okay, I'm gonna really have to scoot. So looking at perennials, so instead of vinca, or periwinkle, some people call it, we've got roundleaf snowberry, or Symphocarpus rotundifolius. So this one is, it's a perennial. It's also kind of a woody. It can be a little bit shrubby, but it gets these delicate little bell-shaped flowers. It's really good for slopes. It's going to stabilize soil really well. It's low growing. It'll get maybe a foot and a half tall, and it has really cool fruit that it looks like little kind of white snowberries, and it can handle some shade, which is great. Instead of tick seed or coreopsis, we've got chocolate flower, Berlandiaria lyrata. This is a really fun plant. This is one of my favorite native plants. It's bright yellow, it's cheery, it's happy, it is tough as nails. You will see it growing in some of the hardest spots. It'll volunteer, hardly needs any water, and it'll just be covered in flowers, these yellow flowers all season long. And it's called chocolate flower because it smells like chocolate, particularly when the sun has been on it for a little bit. It's kind of warmed up. And I think that it smells specifically like Hershey's milk chocolate, not other kinds of chocolate, not dark chocolate, Hershey's milk chocolate. Again, extremely drought tolerant. This was in a demonstration garden at the Boulder County Extension Office, and it was a volunteer. We didn't actually plant it there, but plants move around, and I think it's fine. Again, if you plan for that, knowing that some things are going to shift and move, so we decided to let it be, and it got 0 supplemental water and just was super duper happy. Chives. Some people plant chives as ornamentals instead of those. We've got blue flax. Kind of fills a similar niche, is covered in, it has these slender stems and absolutely abundant blooms, pretty little kind of periwinkle color. The flowers are very, very delicate, and they drop their petals, and at the end of the day, it is sort of a pretty little scattering of petals, but then they're just constantly blooming. You see these quite a bit in the industry. Instead of chrysanthemums, so people plant chrysanthemums in the fall, and instead of that, you could consider rabbit brush. So we've got very mounding rabbit brushes. This is baby blue, so it's a more compact dwarf option, kind of silvery foliage, and then it gets these nice yellow blooms in the fall. Again, chrysanthemums bloom in the fall, but people put them out. They're not perennial. They take them in, or they just pitch them or compost them. But rabbit brush is a perennial. It's going to bloom year after year after year, and it's excellent for pollinators because it blooms so late in the season, which is really important to provide those late season bloomers. Instead of silver mounds, we have lots of artemisias. This is a good example of, somebody was asking about buckthorn. Isn't buckthorn invasive? So with artemisia, there are tons and tons of Artemisia species. This one is not native, but this one is. We've got fringed sage. It has silvery foliage year-round, similar to all the other Artemisias. It has a little bit of a spreading growth habit. It's kind of mounding. It works nicely in rock gardens, and then it gets these spikes of flowers. Most Artemisias are actually wind pollinated, but bees do tend to like this one. So you're providing a little bit of habitat for bees, native bees. Instead of May-night salvia, we've got front range beard tongue or Penstemon virens. So we have lots of penstemons here in Colorado, which we're lucky for because they're great. But May-night salvia has kind of a very erect, upright, tidy kind of look. And this is a penstemon, this beard tongue, that is also that way. It kind of is compact and upright and pretty tidy, and lots of flowers. Floriferous means it just blooms a lot. Instead of zinnias, so zinnias come in lots of different colors, but we have something that has a similar look to this colored one, and that is blanket flower, Gaillardia aristata. A lot of people are probably familiar with Gaillardia pulchella, which is native to further east. It has a little bit more red in it, but this is the one that is really more native to the Front Range area. Blooms mid to late summer, gets the yellow, oranges, and reds. Bees love it. And there's also a moth. If you can see the moths on the center there, it's called a fire moth. And if you're really into geeking out around pollinators, the entire life cycle of this moth happens on this plant. They never leave. And it has a really small range. So it's in Boulder County, Larimer County, and it goes up into Wyoming a little bit. So we're starting to see crocus popping their heads out, which is always fun. And crocus are lovely, but we've got a native little early bloomer, and that is pasque flower. They get the early spring blooms, are kind of a lavendery color, and then they get the fun, kind of funky ornamental seed heads. People plant oregano, ornamental oregano, but instead of that, we've got bee balm, Monarda fistulosa. Again, there are a lot of monardas or bee balms, and you'll see them with like bigger flowers. You'll see red and I don't know what other colors they come in, but again, this is our native. It has a pretty lavender color, has really fragrant foliage. It's in the mint family, so if you crush it, it has a nice aromatic leaf, and the flowers too. And as you can see from the picture, all the butterflies, pollinators really, really love this. Bees also love this one. People make tea out of it, so it's a great one. Instead of delphinium, so delphinium is lovely. More often than not, I see them lodging, so they get really tall and they get those really heavy flowers, and then they flop over and people have to kind of corral them in and hold them up. So Rocky Mountain penstemon or Penstemon strictus is a great alternative. It doesn't lodge, so that's what that's called when plants kind of flop over, they're lodging. These ones do not lodge. They're very upright. And again, like a lot of our penstemons, super floriferous, they're just lots and lots of blooms. And pollinators love penstemons. Bumblebees really tend to love a lot of our penstemons, I think, because they're bigger, they have big flowers, and they can get in there and land. Instead of garden phlox, we've got Rocky Mountain bee plant. So they have kind of a similar globe-shaped purple flower. One thing about Rocky Mountain bee plant is that they grow quite large in a single season, easily 3-4 feet tall, but they're an annual. So they complete their whole life cycle in one season, whereas a perennial comes back year after year. So that is kind of an oddity here, but they will be absolutely covered in bees and other pollinators when they're blooming. There's another picture of the flower, and you can see all the flowers kind of in the background that are out of focus. But if you plant Rocky Mountain bee plant, they bloom a little bit later in the season, and it will just absolutely be covered with pollinators. And they're a really pretty bright colored flower. Okay, Hemerocallis daylily. Instead of these, I hardly ever see pollinators on daylilies, but we have something called desert prince's plume. This is an extremely drought-tolerant plant. Really, this is one where if you give it too much water, it's not going to like it. It might die. But you can see kind of a um, similar yellow flower. And if I go back, well, you can't really see in that picture, but it kind of has similar sort of strappy leaves. It does best in alkaline soils. What we have in Colorado for the most part is alkaline soils. You see this one on the west slope quite a bit along roadsides. So if you decide to try planting this, you want to make sure that you don't amend the soil a lot. You're not putting in compost or fertilizer. Just give it kind of some tough soil. Don't water it too much. It's going to be happy. All right, now we're going to look at some grasses and grass alternatives. So instead of blue avena grass, we've got little blue stem. So you can see pretty similar kind of look and color there. Little blue stem gets some great fall color. So they get pretty kind of poofy seed heads, individual seed heads, and then they turn sort of this orangey, rusty color in the fall. So again, you get that nice winter interest. So if you leave your ornamental grasses up through the winter, then it can be a really pretty contrast against snow and something to look at. You know, you don't need to just chop everything down and put everything totally to bed in the winter, but I think our gardens can provide some winter interest. So they're very upright, great for wildlife. Like I was saying, this is one, there are several species of butterfly larvae that rely on little blue stem for food. Now this is not a grass, but if you really like that look of blue avena, you could consider yucca. It's got that blue silver foliage. Again, you've got to be careful about where you put it. You're not going to want to plant yucca right next to a sidewalk, but if you have kind of a planting island, maybe sort of in the middle of an area, this is going to be excellent for winter interest. And again, this is actually considered more of a shrub, but kind of a similar look. Okay, Carl Forester. So this is a plant that people absolutely love, but at this point it is so overused. There's just Carl Forester everywhere, and for good reason, because it's attractive, but we've got some great native alternatives. So Indian grass, or Sorghastrum nutans, has that bluish green foliage and then the nice blonde seed heads on top. Very upright, so very similar habit. And again, really pretty and attractive seed head. Instead of miscanthus, alkali saccatone is a great alternative. Both have that kind of upright and arching habit, and alkali saccatone has really pretty seed heads that, like, when the light catches it, it's just absolutely beautiful. Also, instead of miscanthus, you could consider that same Indian grass. So upright, and gets a really attractive seed head. So I feel like with native plants, there are lots of really great grasses. So I didn't mention switchgrass. That's a fantastic native grass. Big blue stem is a really great grass, really attractive seed heads. Lots of really good ornamental grasses in the native category. All right, let's see. We've got about 20 minutes left until our time is up. So I'm going to go through a little bit. I always get lots of questions about plants for pollinators. And I know I've been covering with a lot of what I've been saying. I've been saying this is a great pollinator plant. But that's really where sort of people are moving to. They're really starting to sort of garden with purpose. So, we're not just looking at water savings. We're not just looking at beautification. We're looking at all of the functions of our landscape. Are we saving water? Are we providing habitat, increasing biodiversity? All these different things. One way to think about it is sort of stacking functions. So it's kind of like our landscapes can be multitasking. They're not just doing one thing for us, but lots of things all at the same time. So I'm going to go through some lists. There are going to be some repeats, but just talking about native plants that are great for pollinators that are available in nurseries and can do really well for you. So one is sulfur flower, called sulfur flower, because it has these bright yellow, sort of sulfur yellow um, uh, flowers. And they get that, you can sort of see that mounding foliage that's sort of grayish green. In the wintertime, in the fall, it gets really pretty fall color, actually. It turns kind of a dark, kind of maroon color, and it stays that way all winter long. So again, you can have that winter interest. Butterflies love these plants. Penstemons, I mentioned penstemons. We've got lots of different penstemons here. So I mentioned virens and strictus. We also have penstemon barbatus, and there are others. So bumblebees, pollinating wasps, hummingbirds, native bees, they're all going to be attracted to penstemon. Paintbrush is a really good one for hummingbirds. This is going to be a little bit trickier, but if you want a challenge, you can try to get a paintbrush to grow. We have cacti that are fun to grow. So claret cup is a beautiful cactus. It gets covered in those bright red, sort of crimson flowers in late spring, early summer. Again, super dry, and hummingbirds. You're going to see hummingbirds and bees just absolutely devouring the pollen and nectar in claret cup. There are lots and lots of asters, and this is Aster elegans. This is a native aster. It's going to get about, it's a perennial, but it kind of acts a little bit shrubby. So it can get pretty big, 2 to 4 feet, and it'll be covered in these tiny little aster flowers. Butterflies love this plant. I already mentioned Rocky Mountain raspberry, or Boulder raspberry, sometimes it's called. Native bees and flower flies love this one. Flower flies are actually a really important pollinator. So again, thinking beyond just honeybees, we've got over 1,000 species of native bees in Colorado. We've got hundreds of butterflies and moths, and flower flies are important pollinators. So again, I already mentioned chokecherry, but this is a great spring bloomer. It blooms early. It's important to have things that bloom early in the season, as long into the summer as possible, and then into the early fall too. So again, native bees and flower flies. Flies tend to be attracted to white flowers and flowers that aren't super sweet, but they might even smell a little bit icky to us. Flies are going to be more attracted to those. Serviceberry, already mentioned those. Super excellent for native bees and flies. Rosa woodsii. So this would have been another alternative to the shrub rose. But there are hundreds of species of native plants. I certainly can't mention them all. Was just doing that sort of plant this, not that kind of alternative option. But this is our native rose species, and it's a shrub. It gets 3 to 5 feet. It can handle a little bit more moisture, but it can do really well in drought too. And it's going to bloom pretty early in the spring, all through the summer. Bees absolutely love it. Already mentioned the golden currant, Ribes aerium. I think I talked about that one enough, but it's a great one. There you can see the pretty small picture, but on the bottom right there, you can see the habit, and it just gets covered in those yellow flowers. And I should say that the leaves, you do get some fall color too, which is nice. You get kind of a red fall color, so more seasonal interest. Very hardy. Okay, here's Bouteloua gracilla. So this is blue grama. Blue grama is Colorado's state grass, which is fun. One way to remember it, people think that the seed heads look like grandma's eyelashes. They kind of curve up. Those ones are kind of straight, but they get kind of a curve. So some people remember the name that way. So you can plant the straight species, or Blonde Ambition is a super popular cultivar of that. And they are a larval host for butterflies. Also just really, really pretty. Little blue stem, we already talked about that. Larval host for butterflies, super drought tolerant. Okay, so that is our plant list. And I see there are more questions, but I'm going to finish kind of going through about how you pair things and how you treat native plants, and then I'll wrap up with the questions. So we can plant things that actually grow together naturally, right? In sort of selecting, how do we decide what we're going to plant? How do we pair things together? So this is a picture of, that's actually me and my grandmother. We're up in Wyoming at their cabin, and you can see it's just a banner year for wildflowers. So just happened to be a really, really excellent year. So that you could look at those species and decide, okay, this is how I'm going to pair these things together. I saw them growing naturally that way. That's what I want to plant. We can also plant what looks good together. So we might be looking at color combinations. And so like this, we've got the yellow and the purple complementary colors. Or we might be looking at bloom sizes and shapes. It's nice to have a variety of bloom sizes and shapes. You don't want them all to be exactly the same. It's just going to provide different texture and different variety. Oh, there's my plant list there. And then we can also plant things, and we should plant things with like needs together. So if we're planting really, really xeric plants, we want to make sure that they're all xeric. If you throw in a really water-loving plant, it's not going to get the water that it needs. Same goes for soil type and sun exposure. So you want to pay attention to all of those things. When we're thinking about our planting plan, of course, seasonal interest is important. Bloom time, when are things blooming? You know, you don't want to have a garden where everything blooms in the spring and then nothing blooms after, you know, June. You want to think about color. You want to think about the texture that you're going to have. Of course, I've already mentioned this, water needs, exposure. How big do things get? Super important to pay attention to the mature size of plants. You know, they might be really teeny tiny when you bring them home from the nursery, and it might be really tempting to put them a little closer together so that it looks more, it's just a little more satisfying right after you plant it. But you can really run into problems there. You want to pay attention to the mature spacing or the mature size and space them accordingly. And then the function of the plant. So you might want to screen noise or screen something visual. Maybe you live along a busy street. You can use plant material to kind of, you know, mitigate that. You might be planting for food. You might want to be able to forage in your yard. You want to think about the structure of the plant. So do I have really strong architectural things? Do I have some things that are a little bit softer, and how can you combine those? And then maintenance. Maintenance is super important. A couple of thoughts on maintenance. For one thing, you want to make sure that the maintenance of your garden, or rather that you match your maintenance, what's the word I'm looking for? Like interest, the amount of maintenance that you're willing to do. You want to make sure that you match that with what you plant. If you don't have a lot of time, but you want to have a garden, things like shrubs and ornamental grasses that don't need to be deadheaded or, you know, whatever, just don't require quite as much maintenance is probably going to be the way to go. If you can just be kind of putzing around in your garden all the time, then you can have lots of different plants and have more maintenance needs. I will say native plants don't have to be messy. It depends on your goal. It depends on your aesthetic for your garden. They don't have to be messy. Any plant is going to require specific treatments to achieve a particular result, right? So a native plant can be potentially sheared and deadheaded or exfoliated, whatever it might be. So whether it's native or non-native, they can be kind of somewhat tailored to your desires. And it's important to know that natives don't shine in the nursery. So when you walk into a nursery and you see those beds and benches and shelves full of just picture perfect plants, like each pot looks pretty much the same, those plants have been bred and bred and bred to look like that in a nursery container, in a tiny little pot of soil. They did not look like that naturally. So native plants, now that they're getting into the industry and getting into the mainstream more, people are trying to get them to, they're trying to figure out how to put them through what are called finishing protocols to be able to put them in a pot and sell them and have them be attractive in um, a nursery container. It's important to remember that they're kind of diamonds in the rough. Okay, so you have to be able to see the potential. It might not look amazing. You definitely might have people saying like, wow, you planted a yard full of sticks. But the next year or 2 years or even 3 years down the line, it's, the potential there is just going to be really amazing. So something to keep in mind with natives. Cut them a little slack. Spring and fall cleanup. So that's potentially a bit of a difference. Not so much with natives, but people who are planting natives tend to also be gardening for wildlife to some degree. And we want to make sure that we're supporting that wildlife year round. So we're not just thinking about the flowers that we're planting, but lots of invertebrates. Insects, beneficial insects, are going to overwinter like at the base of ornament or at the base of grasses and in leaf litter. So if you attract those critters to your yard with your flowers, and you're feeling good about supporting them, but then you cut everything back as soon as it gets cold and you rake out all the leaves so that it doesn't look messy, then there's nowhere for those things that you attracted to your garden to overwinter and complete their life cycle. So just gaining a little more understanding there is important. Again, since we're talking about maintenance, generally these native plants are going to use less water. So you want to know your irrigation. Definitely have seen people get excited about transitioning to native plants, but they never adjusted their irrigation system and they've applied way too much water and ended up killing their plants. Generally, you're not going to need any fertilizer. Often won't need many soil amendments. It's a good idea to do a soil test to see what kind of soil you have. It's easier to match plants to soil than it is to match soil to plants. Mulch is important. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. Soil amendment recipes. So this is not going to hold true always and forever, but Kelly Grummins, who is an excellent plants person, he has a recipe. So if you have a really highly clayey soil and you're trying to break that up a little bit, if you add 10% wood-based compost or like a planter's mix, 20% small aggregate or crusher fines, and you really mix that in and incorporate that well, it's gonna break up that clay nicely, and you're gonna be able to have a nice planting bed. If soils are super duper compacted, that's a hard thing to work with, whether you're planting natives or otherwise. So you want to try to loosen that up. And if your soil is very sandy, gravelly, or it's just been scraped off, because people move into places and they're like, this isn't native soil. It's like, who knows what the developer put in. You might want to add some organic matter like a compost to improve the tilth and sort of the nutrient holding capacity of the soil. But again, doing a soil test is a great idea. I just saw the time. I'm going to cruise through this. Hydrozones is how you plant, or is planting by water need. So again, don't mix really xeric with water-loving plants. You can think about microclimates when you're planting, and kind of play with that. So rocks and berms and walls and structures are going to create different microclimates. So like the east side of your house is going to be much warmer than the west side of your house. The south side of your house is going to be warmer than the north side of your house. And then finally, I want to mention something called root washing. This is something that a lot of people are starting to do, and it helps perennials establish more quickly. Don't want to worry about it doing this with, annuals like petunias, but it's going to help with that early drought stress that plants go through when planting. And it's sort of like bare root planting. So you're going to get good contact with the native soil. And you can see that's the same plant in those two pictures. So the first picture on the left, it was just taken out of the pot. On the right, it's been just sort of like swirled around gently in some water and kind of gently teased out. You're going to have to dig a deeper hole but not a big hole, just deep, and you kind of feed those roots down in and kind of close up the hole. And people are noticing that the plants go through much less transplant shock, and they just get established more quickly. Quick note on mulch. We've got lots of different materials that we can use for mulch, but we want to match the mulch to our plants. So generally speaking, xeriscapes and native plantings are going to have a rock mulch. And that's because these really dry plants don't want to have thick bark mulch or wood mulch that hold moisture. It might rot them out. So just do your research on the mulch. So again, another note on native plants, there's something called genius loci, and it means the spirit of a place. Lady Bird Johnson has a famous quote. She said, "Wherever I go in America, I like it when the land speaks its own language and its own regional accent. Texas should look like Texas," and I'll change it to say Colorado should look like Colorado. And then finally, this is my last slide. Here are some native plant resources. So CONIPS, Colorado Native Plant Society, they have a native plant vendor list. They also hold a virtual plant sale. If you're just wanting to research native plants, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center NIPIN, Native Plant Information Network, has great information. You can, just read all about it, where it's native to, how big it gets, what color it is. And then again, looking at more native plants, there's SignNet. If you just Google SignNet, you'll be able to see lots of native plants in situ out in the field and kind of get a sense for what they are. So, whew. Okay, I thank you all very much. I know that we have not very long left, but I'm going to go ahead and try to answer some of these questions. Phoebe, anything you need to say before we hop off?
Yeah, I will just go ahead and do my kind of official sign off. Thanks y'all for joining us tonight. We are going to stay on and do a couple of questions until 8. There will be an email going out tomorrow that has a summary of Deryn's like plant this instead of this list. We'll also include some of these resources that Deryn just talked about, like the NIP, Lady Bird Johnson, and the Colorado Native Plant Society. Thanks y'all so much, and go ahead and stay with us and we'll answer a few more of these questions.
Okay, great. I'll get through as many as I can in 2 minutes, and then I could stay on a little bit longer too. Are natives more pest resistant than non-natives? Yes, because what happens with non-natives is they're planted and they're not from around here. And so they can just get decimated. So like emerald ash borer is a great example. We planted all these ash trees, and then emerald ash borer came around and it's just decimating that population. So native plants have native pests, but they're not usually going to overtake them and be as big of an issue. Perhaps you can discuss potential sources. So I'm gonna click back. So there's some there, and it sounds like Phoebe's gonna send out some other resources. CSU Extension, if you go to CSU Extension and go to publications, we also have a native plant vendor list. Can you plant around established trees without hurting the tree roots? So I talked about this a little bit, but it's hard. You do have to be really careful. Trees send out feeder roots that go very, very, they're pretty shallow. Most of the trees' roots are within like the first 12 inches of soil, and they go out wide rather than deep. And so any digging around in there, you're going to really be messing with the tree roots. So you got to be careful. It can be done, but you definitely want to take some precautions there. Which switchgrass is native? Switchgrass is switchgrass. So there are cultivars, but switchgrass is native and it's excellent. It likes a little more moisture though. I bought native plant mixes and tick seed was in it. Is it because it's native to Kansas? Probably. A lot of times we'll get like seed packets that say native wildflower mix. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's native to Colorado or your area. But that tick seed, perhaps it is native a little further east. Native evergreen trees. So yeah, we have a lot of native evergreens. We've got juniper, we've got firs, spruce, ponderosa pine. There are plenty of those, and a lot of them work down here. They're all native to further west in higher elevation. but we definitely do have native evergreen trees. Again, I couldn't do an exhaustive list. In a small yard already landscaped with many plants on my no list when you moved in, what is recommended? Remove and replace or just tuck in natives where they fit? I say tuck in natives where they fit. Plants are going to die out eventually. Go ahead and, replace them with natives as they die. And yeah, so I think that's the way to go. So it's 8:01. I think we're
Yeah.
almost there though.
We're there. Yeah.
Replanting larger area with initial drip system to get new plants established and then withholding mostly water after 2 years. Yep, if you're replanting and you already have a drip system, keep that drip system going. Native plants are like any other plant. There's going to be a establishment period. So the first year to 3 years, depending on the plant. And then exactly the idea is you can cut that back and hopefully only provide supplemental water during really, really dry periods.
Okay.
I do see that native suggestion instead of peony. I love peonies. I absolutely love peonies. There's nothing with that huge, beautiful flower that's the same. I would say just plant your peonies and then put
Yeah.
natives all around it.
Yeah, there you go.
And then northeastern Colorado is semi-arid. What native plants are best here? That's where you're going to want to actually find a plant list and use some of the other resources and kind of piece that together. So, okay, we made it through them all.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Deryn. Thanks for staying on to answer a few of those. Thanks everybody. I hope you have a good night and stay warm in this snow that's coming. Again, look out for that email. We'll send you all the resources that Deryn provided. Thank you. Have a
Okay,
good night.
thanks everybody. Take care. Bye.